Game preservation. Now you might be wondering, why is game preservation so important? I mean, they're just video games at the end of the day. There's actually quite a few reasons that you might not have thought about before or might be quite interested in. One quite big issue is that digital games cannot be resold. Now, this might sound obvious to a lot of people, especially if you've been used to buying digital games, but if you think about it, physical games, not only can you go and buy them brand new, but you can also go and buy them pre-owned. Or, alternatively, if you want to sell your game, you can actually sell it to someone else. You can't do this at the moment with digital games. Now, that's one interesting thing about blockchain and NFT and all the rest of the buzzwords. That's quite interesting about that kind of technology, is that might enable in the future people to be able to resell their digital games, or maybe even buy digital games from other people in a similar way that you can with physical games. That's not the case at the moment. NFTs are just basically scams at the moment and just trying to gouge people out of money, which is really sad, but it's also not that surprising as the internet and people can be fooled quite easily. But hopefully in the future that will actually be the case, although I wouldn't put your hopes up that high. The second reason, which is even more important, is that there's a lot of digital games that don't even have a physical release. One interesting example is a game called Gunman Clive. Now that has actually had a Switch port, and there are companies, especially for the Switch, but even for other devices as well, like limited run games, where they will make digital only games available in a physical form. But even then, that's only for a limited release, hence the name of the particular company. But in Gunman Clive case, although it did come to the Switch eventually, originally it was a 3DS only game, and it was also a digital only game as well. Now that game, had it not gone to the Switch, would be completely locked to the 3DS. And the reason why I'm making this video now is recently Nintendo have announced that both the Wii U and 3DS, consoles which, although are admittedly quite old at this point, are not as old as you might think they are. The Wii U is about 10 years old roughly, and the 3DS about 11 years old, but both of those stores are going to be shut down in roughly 2024, with the ability to buy the games going to be shut down in March of 2023. Now for a game like Gunman Clive in this case, you would not be able to buy that game at all. There's no physical release as far as I know. There might be one now, but when it initially launched there was no physical release, and when the 3DS store was shut down there will be no digital release of it either. So unless you just happen to buy it while it was still available, you can never buy it again, and that's one of the biggest issues. Now obviously there are pretty better games I can think of as a better example, but that's just one that came to my head, you know, initially. And Nintendo is definitely not alone in this case. Xbox has been the best one actually, because they haven't really taken anything down. Sony in particular has been quite active with this. So Nintendo has completely shut down the DS and the Wii store now, because those were the first Nintendo consoles to have a digital storefront. But those have been not only shut down to buy games, but they've even been shut down like full stop. I think you can still download games you have bought, but you can't buy any games. I don't think you can even really browse it that much anymore. But yeah, so those have been completely shut down. And mid last year, Sony announced that the PS3 and PS Vita stores were going to be shut down. Now, because of the backlash online, they were delayed a little bit, but developers were not allowed to publish any new games to the store, essentially decentivizing people from continuing to use those services. Certainly not just Nintendo, it's also Sony as well. But as games get increasingly more and more online and more digital, because that's what a lot of these companies want, they want you to buy digitally because they make more of a profit than they do physically. But as that happens, that means that digital only games are only increasing. There still isn't that many ways to play these digital games. Now, if obviously a developer wants to, there's a lot of platforms that they can port these games to, but not all developers want to. Some developers just want a Switch exclusive, some developers want an Xbox exclusive, especially with all these exclusivity wars that are happening now, especially between Xbox and Sony. It's very possible if one console gets shut down, that game might very well just be lost to time. Now, one of the biggest reasons why preserving games is so difficult, and why there's so many reasons as to why a game may not be ported to whatever platform, is because of the legality. I'm obviously no lawyer, I have to disclaim that legally, but when it comes to licensing and when it comes to who owns the rights to what game, it can be anywhere from just like say Nintendo owns the right to Mario, it's just Nintendo, or it could be in the case of Simpsons Hit and Run, it can literally be 5 different entities that have the right to that game. So that game is almost impossible to get to new platforms because there's so many people you've got to try and contact. And that's one of the biggest hurdles to preservation, because can you download a game legally for free and without the publisher permission if they don't give you any alternative? Now, in the case of the UK, it is legal to have one backup of a copyrighted work, so long as it is necessary. Now, what necessary means is up to a court and up to a judge, but essentially you can only have one backup, and that's obviously up to UK law, as far as I've researched, so it might be different in other places. But the point being is that it's very difficult to know what you can back up and what you can't back up, and even if having an online repository is technically piracy, or because there's no other alternative, that is completely legal. That's the main issue for preservation. But as we said before, there'll be no other options to play it if we don't preserve these games. So I think that's more of a moral dilemma at the moment than a legal one. Another interesting point, which you may not have even considered, is that some companies have actually lost the source code or lost parts of a game. So even if they wanted to remaster or remake or even just port certain games, they literally can't. And I think it was Square Enix that lost the source code to their games, which means that they literally could not port that. And so without preservation efforts, a game like that would just be completely lost. So the TLDR then. Basically, game preservation may not seem that important on the service. It may seem like, well, I can buy it, so what's the problem? The main problem is that a lot of people in the future will not have that option because the companies decide for them, we don't want to support this game anymore, we don't want to support this device anymore. So people won't have that option if they didn't before, and even the people who do have the option now may not be able to afford it, and there's a lot of other factors. But essentially, without game preservation, we will lose a lot of games. And there's probably some games you've never even heard of because of it being lost. Especially, this isn't gaming, but especially back in like, you know, the early days of cinema, for example, the vast majority wasn't backed up because they didn't think that far ahead. They just made a film and then overrode the tape or whatever afterwards. So many silent films and short films that era are lost because they didn't bother to preserve it, which is why, in the sense of gaming, a lot of people want to preserve these games because they had such good experiences with them. And so, without game preservation, without the really hard effort of modders and of emulation developers, we would lose a lot of these games completely. And even if you're not interested in a certain game, there's always going to be somebody that is, and it's kind of unfair to prevent that person from playing it, even though they've paid for it and they want to experience it again on a modern platform. Thanks for watching. I thought this was important and I wanted to add to the conversation. If you have anything else to add, you know what the comments are. Like and subscribe and do all the YouTube stuff. And I'm gonna go and maybe buy some Wii U games or play my PS Vita because those are awesome consoles. See you.